Hello there, my friends, and welcome back to our series where we talk about book reviews, discussions, and synopses of Warhammer novels, both fantasy and 40k. I'm the GrimDark narrator, and as I've been mentioning over the last couple of videos, through this series I would like to review and discuss not just Warhammer fantasy books, as I've done so far, but 40k stuff as well, because throw knows I read plenty of those too. Given that, believe it or not, there's actually considerably more 40k literature than there is Warhammer Fantasy lit. And for those who already are familiar with the dozens and dozens of Warhammer Fantasy novels in existence, you know that's saying something. But for today, I wanted to try something a bit different. We won't be discussing or spoiling any one novel of any kind. Instead, I wanted to share my thoughts and discuss a bit about the gigantic and ultra-epic series known as the Horus Heresy. I'm also doing this because whenever I do start on individual Horus Heresy novels, I do wanted folks to have at least a bit of an introduction to the saga first. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment and kindly ask you that if you enjoy these videos, and would like to hear a lot more, you should definitely check out my Patreon page. There you can find a lot more content, stories, and other things to listen to, including content from my old YouTube channel. But also new stuff that I'm gonna be making exclusively for there. High quality stuff. It's also my sole source of income, so do feel free to join as a free member for starters, and you can check out everything for yourselves. The links are in the description. So, what is the Horus Heresy series, and why should you care? For starters, I would say that it's probably the most epic, and by far the lengthiest space opera series of books that you will ever read. Assuming, of course, that you do get through all of it, which is an achievement in and of itself. In the second half of the video, I also decided to list all the books under the umbrella of the series. And in fact, one wouldn't be wrong in calling the Horus Heresy its own franchise within overall 40k. I mean, GW and Black Library definitely treated it as a sub-franchise. The Horus Heresy, for those of you who are completely unfamiliar with 40k lore, refers to a period of galactic civil war in the distant past of the Imperium. Roughly 10,000 years or so prior to the present era of modern 40k. Give or take a couple of thousand years, since we have, the more modern stuff with the Primarch and the Sundering of the Galaxy and that sort of thing. But we're not gonna get into that today. It was, arguably, the greatest conflict in the history of the Imperium, with half of the legendary Space Marine legions and their Primarch leaders betraying the Emperor and joining the cause of Horus, after whom the whole event is named. So, you might be wondering, how on earth do you write over 100 books about just that basic premise? You write it, of course, by expanding the small bits of lore from the late 80s and 90s, by around, 100,000%. You create new characters, of course, but you also double and triple down on the ones you have. And in the Horus Heresy, even though there's hundreds of named characters across dozens of full novels and dozens more short stories and novellas, the stars, in my opinion, are undoubtedly the Primarchs. These are the demigod-esque leaders of the Space Marine legions, 18 of them to be more precise, or 19 if you want to include the 2 of the Alpha Legion. Or are they? The Primarchs have always been the focal points of many Horus Heresy books, even if more often than not the stories are told through characters interacting with the Primarchs, and from their point of views. I'm not here today, of course, to overview each Primarch in turn. I have in fact made videos about those, you can find them on my Rumble channel, or talk about the specifics of each Space Marine Legion, which I also did videos on. Still, these demigods and their warriors almost always draw much of the attention to them, both in-universe and the attention of the readers and the fans, I would say. I mean, I do remember way back when, probably around 2008 or 2009 or so, when I started reading these, how awe-inspiring the Primarch appearances were, because there weren't that many in the early books. And I remember being especially excited when a new Horus Heresy novel came out, and it was focused on something entirely different from stuff that came before. Like, there is a main focus on the Luna Wolves, for example, later Sons of Horus in the original trilogy. But not much later, I think it was the 5th or the 6th, that we get a full Grim novel, which switched it up and focused on the Emperor's children. We had Flight of the Eisenstein, which focused on the Death Guard. Considerably later, we got stuff like Thousand Suns, which focused on, who would have imagined it, the Thousand Suns. Or Prospero Burns, which delves into the Space Wolves' customs and traditions. Or Scars, which was the first full novel focused on the White Scars. And each of these was almost like opening an encyclopedia on an entirely different topic from the previous encyclopedia you read. But back to the Horus Heresy overall. There is definitely a plethora of themes to analyze through the saga, but I think there's a handful that are more universal than others, which I would like to draw your attention to today. Obviously, the most in-your-face is treason versus loyalty. The forces of Horus are all traitors who turned from the banner of the Emperor and began consorting with the powers of chaos, with demons and other unsavory elements. Aliens, monsters, Lovecraftian entities, and even worse. And one of the interesting sub-aspects, if you will, of this particular theme is how the traitors came to be traitors to begin with. Because obviously it wasn't the same for all of them, given how different their backgrounds, their cultures, and even command styles were. Some, for a very long time, believed that they were the good guys all along, and that they weren't doing anything actually evil. To them, it was the Emperor who betrayed them, and Horus was the good guy. The guy who would make the Imperium great again. Others were embracing new creeds or faiths, and didn't really care about the barriers between good and evil, as long as they felt that they were doing the right thing according to their beliefs. Like the Word-Bearers. Meanwhile, other traitors kinda jumped ship with Horus because they were embittered and disillusioned, and felt that the Emperor didn't give a damn about them or outright hated the Emperor, like Angron of the World Eaters or Mortarion and the Death Guard. And then we have those that were more or less evil from the get-go, or at least a bunch of cruel assholes like the Night Lords. Another pillar of the themes in the Horus Heresy, in my opinion, is the contradiction between the secular and the spiritual. I mean, at the end of the day, the Emperor was kind of a hypocrite. He did start building the Imperium and outright lied to 99% of his people, including the Primarchs. Even from the very first novel of the saga, Horus Rising, we are introduced to the fascinating dichotomy persisting throughout much of the whole series. The Emperor conquered a galaxy on the premise that religion and spirituality were things to be abandoned. Superstition had to go, because this was an enlightened age, an age of reason and of scientific dominance, where all the answers could be obtained using, science and reason. But at the same time, this was more of a lie, because chaos and the warp were real, demons were real, and actually worshipping them and the chaos gods could produce tangible results. Terrible results that you should never attempt, but results and things nonetheless. And I think the impact this doctrine has, even when the good guys realize that chaos is real, and it corrupted a ton of Space Marines and Primarchs and whatnot, is fascinating to observe. Because they all approach the chaos problem with different attitudes and perceived solutions. I mean, the Word-Bearers just embrace it and never look back. The Ultramarines, for the longest time, tried to rationalize it and fight it conventionally. The Iron Warriors, for another example, despite being traitors, they never actually embraced full demons, and tried to stay as true to themselves as they could. And that's just a couple of examples. Of course, we can definitely make comparisons between this no religion as opposed to extreme religion theme and, real life. how many of us still have faith in simply this or that? Or just general faith when something goes bad and you quote-unquote pray for a better outcome? On the other hand, how many of us always try to find rational explanations for the things that surround us or happen to us, and simply discard or even despise those relying on faith? Now, obviously I'm not here to tell you that one or these is better than the other. And at the end of the day, you can just do you and do what makes you feel okay. But I think if there is one lesson that we can all learn from what happened during the Horus Heresy, is that extremes are always bad. Would things have been better if the Emperor trusted his sons a bit more and told them about the dangers of the warp? Maybe. Would things have been better if Lorgar, already a religious nut, would have actually used a bit more common sense before selling his soul to chaos? I think definitely. The third of the main themes, and probably the last one we're gonna go into today, is the cosmic father versus son dynamic. Because at the end of the day, if you want to oversimplify it, the Horus Heresy is about a beloved son believing that he was lied to and betrayed by his father, and as a result throws a tantrum of literal galactic proportions. Who was right or wrong in this situation? The Emperor, who kept some truths to himself and used his sons as tools more often than not, but all this in the service of basically elevating humanity to the best it could ever be? Or Horus, who believed that all his sacrifices and battles won and the territories conquered entitled him to at least know everything that the Emperor was doing? Of course, the moral here is that neither of them were actually fully right, but probably not entirely wrong either. I mean, the Emperor did keep one secret too many and it bit him in the ass eventually, but Horus did act like a spoiled child as well about it. I think that the lesson, once again, is to avoid extremes, and maybe once in a while use some logic and reason before you start summoning demons. We can also compare the fight, both ideologically and otherwise, in my opinion, between father and son, as the coming of age of a whole civilization, if that makes any sense. The Imperium during the Great Crusade is quote-unquote innocent, for lack of a better term. As are most of the Primarchs, actually. They don't know about chaos, or they do know but they don't understand in the beginning, and the perversities and twisted corruption it will eventually bring. It is Warhammer before the Imperium became GrimDark, in contrast to the bright, optimistic and forward-looking Imperium from the earliest novels, with the decay at the very end. The Horus Heresy is the literal death of hope for humanity, which will lock them into the perpetual grimdark stagnation of the 41st millennium and beyond. Another interesting aspect concerning this series is that we actually all know how it's gonna end. And those of you who might not know anything about the Horus Heresy might ask, what's the point of going through all of this? I know Horus dies, I know the Emperor is crippled, I know Sanguinius dies, RIP, etc. And to those asking those questions, I would like to point you towards Star Wars Rogue One, and even the show Andor. In my opinion, but I know a majority of fans agree with this, neither of those two were considered in any way necessary projects. Heck, even I thought that Rogue One was a stupid idea before I watched it. I mean, you already know what happens. What could you possibly tell me about it that's worth watching? But afterwards I stood corrected. Not only was it arguably the best Star Wars movie since Revenge of the Sith, but it was a good thing on its own, and it also tied neatly into the stuff we already knew from the OG trilogy. Now, take that mentality and expand it by about 10,000%, and you have the Horus Heresy. I haven't been speaking of the more regular characters in the saga yet, but that's because there's so many, and some are definitely hugely memorable too, and you are gonna laugh and cry alongside them, even though they obviously don't appear in all 60+ novels. And the bright side is that many of them are characters created specifically for the book series. So even though you know Sanguinis is gonna die, there are many characters that you will care about that you don't know the fate of. And you will be invested because of that. I know I was. Garvia Lucan, I'm looking at you. At the end of the day, without a doubt, I do think that the Horus Heresy is a saga worth investing your time into. Even if you don't actually read every single book, you definitely don't have to. I mean, there are some books which are more central to the overall narrative, where important stuff happens, but there's also some books that are more or less side adventures, but which are still equally good or maybe even better than some of the main entries. And yeah, there are some volumes that are not as good as the others. Stuff like Descent of Angels or Damnation of Pythos, for example. But your mileage will definitely vary. I mean, I have read scalding 1 out of 5 stars for books that I myself loved, and I read good reviews for books that I thought were mediocre. So it's definitely a read and decide for yourself type of situation. Maybe more so than in other series of franchises even. And that, my friends, has been what I wanted to tell you today about the epic saga of the Horus Heresy. Believe it or not, one of the staples of my own reading practice for about 16 years or so. A journey that you're unlikely to forget if you stick with it through to the end. As always, do feel free to share your thoughts on the Horus Heresy in the comments below if you want. I welcome any and all opinions. Which are your favorite books of it? Which ones do you hate? Which ones would you like to see covered in a bit more detail in this set of videos? Now, as I promised earlier, in the second part of the video, we're gonna be listing all the books in the saga. For your convenience more than mine, to be honest. But maybe it will help somebody to know all of them. I will also be listing them chronologically for what it's worth, for the most part. So, starting with the full novels, and in 2006, we have Horus Rising by Dan Abnett, False Gods by Graham McNeill, Galaxy in Flames by Ben Counter, The Flight of the Eisenstein by James Swallow, Fulgrim by Graham McNeill, Descent of Angels by Mitchell Scanlon, Legion by Dan Abnett, Battle for the Abyss by Ben Counter, Mechanicum by Graham McNeill, Fallen Angels by Mike Lee, 1,000 Suns by Graham McNeill, Nemesis by James Swallow, The First Heretic by Aaron Dembski Bowden, Prospero Burns by Dan Abnett, The Outcast Dead by Graham McNeill, Deliverance Lost by Gav Thorpe, Know No Fear by Dan Abnett, Fear to Tread by James Swallow, Angel Exterminatus by Graham McNeill, Betrayer by Aaron Dembski Bowden, Vulcan Lives by Nick Kime, Stomp Stomp, Unremembered Empire by Dan Abnett, Scars by Chris Wright, Vengeful Spirit by Graham McNeill, The Damnation of Pythos by David Annandale, Deathfire by Nick Kime, Pharos by Guy Haley, The Path of Heaven by Chris Wright, Angels of Caliban by Gav Thorpe, Praetorian of Dorn by John French, The Master of Mankind by Aaron Dembski Bowden, The Crimson King by Graham McNeill, Ruinstorm by David Annandale, Old Earth by Nick Kime, Wolfsbane by Guy Haley, Slaves to Darkness by John French, Titan Death by Guy Haley, and The Buried Dagger by James Swallow. Honorable mention to another small group of books which are meant to feature a couple of popular characters from this period. Valdor, Birth of the Imperium by Chris Wright, Luther, First of the Fallen by Gav Thorpe, and Sigismund, the Eternal Crusader by John French. Next, we're gonna list the anthologies that I consider a bit separate from the main novel entries. These include Tales of Heresy, Age of Darkness, The Primarchs, Shadows of Treachery, Mark of Calth, Angron, The Imperial Truth, Sedition's Gate, Death and Defiance, Blades of the Traitor, Meduson, Betrayal at Calth, Legacies of Betrayal, War Without End, Eye of Terra, The Silent War, Corax, Garrow, Shattered Legions, Talarn, The Burden of Loyalty, Born of Flame, and Heralds of the Siege. The next section includes all the novellas. And word to the wise, some of these are in fact included in the anthologies mentioned earlier, but not all of them. Thus, we have Promethean Sun by Nick Kime, Aurelian by Aaron Dembski-Bowden, Brotherhood of the Storm by Chris Wright, The Reflection Cracked by Graham McNeil, Feet of Iron by Nick Kime, The Lion by Gav Thorpe, The Serpent Beneath by Rob Sanders, Corax Soulforge by Gav Thorpe, Scorched Earth by Nick Kime, Talarn Executioner by John French, Prince of Crows by Aaron Dembski-Bowden, The Crimson Fist by John French, The Purge by Anthony Reynolds, Ravenlord by Gav Thorpe, The Seventh Serpent by Graham McNeil, Talarn Ironclad by John French, Cybernetica by Rob Sanders, Wolf King by Chris Wright, The Honored by Rob Sanders, The Unburdened by David Annandale, Garrow Vow of Faith by James Swallow, Sons of the Forge by Nick Kime, Dreadwing by David Geimer, and Spear of Ultramar by David Annandale. Next, I do think it's worth an honorable mention, the Primarchs series of novellas. This brings us to Robut Guilliman, the Lord of Ultramar by David Annandale, Leman Russ, the Great Wolf by Chris Wright, Magnus the Red, Master of Prospero by Graham McNeil, Perturabo, the Hammer of Olympia by Guy Haley, Lorgar, Bearer of the Word by Gav Thorpe, Fulgrim, the Palatine Phoenix by Josh Reynolds, Ferrus Manus, the Gorgon of Medusa by David Geimer, Jagatai Khan, Warhawk of Chogoris by Chris Wright, Vulcan, Lord of Drakes by David Annandale, Corax, Lord of Shadows by Guy Haley, Angron, Slave of Nuceria by Ian St. Martin, Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter by Guy Haley, Lionel Johnson, Lord of the First by David Geimer, Alfarius, Head of the Hydra by Mike Brooks, Mortarion, the Pale King by David Annandale, Rogel Dorn, the Emperor's Crusader by Gav Thorpe, Sanguinius, the Great Angel by Chris Wright. In addition to these, this sub-series of novellas also had 3 anthologies: Sons of the Emperor, Scions of the Emperor, and Blood of the Emperor. And finally for today, we have the Siege of Terra sub-series, which is basically the ending of the Horus Heresy but turned into its own thing. The Siege of Terra begins with The Solar War by John French, The Lost and the Damned by Guy Haley, The First Wall by Gav Thorpe, Sons of the Selenar by Graham McNeil, Saturnine by Dan Abnett, The Fury of Magnus by Graham McNeil, Mortis by John French, Warhawk by Chris Wright, Echoes of Eternity by Aaron Dembski-Bowden, Garrow, Knight of Grey by James Swallow, and the 3-part grand finale, The End and the Death, volumes 1, 2, and 3, written by Dan Abnett. For those of you who are still around and alive after that infinite laundry list of novels, once again I thank you for listening and I wish you a great day.